The thermometer reads -28 degrees Celsius when Uri Geller adjusts the collar of his grey wool coat, moving through Marszałkowska Street with the precision of someone who knows every irregular stone of the pavement. January 1968 transformed Warsaw into an Arctic landscape where every breath materializes into dense clouds of vapor and where the cold penetrates through the thickest fabrics until it reaches the bones. Geller is not there by chance. At 42 years old, with carefully combed brown hair and metal-framed glasses that reflect the yellowish light of the street lamps, he represents the most sophisticated face of Israeli intelligence operating in hostile territory. His credentials as a cultural journalist for Hadashot magazine serve as the perfect cover for a mission that goes far beyond reporting on Jewish life in communist Poland. Operation Red Snow, as it was christened in the Mossad's confidential files, was born from an urgent need identified by analysts in Tel Aviv 6 months before that implacable winter. Documents intercepted by the Communications Division suggested the existence of a clandestine Jewish emigration network operating in the heart of Warsaw, facilitating the departure of hundreds of Polish Jews to destinations in Western Europe and, eventually, to Israel. What the documents did not reveal were the operational details of this network: who controlled it, how it functioned, what routes it used, and most crucially, if it could be expanded or if it represented a risk of exposure for other Israeli operations in the region. The synagogue on Twarda Street had been rebuilt after the 1944 bombings, emerging from the ruins as one of the few places of Jewish worship still functioning in the Polish capital. Officially, it served a congregation of approximately 200 worshippers, mostly elderly survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto and families who resisted the post-war migration waves. Unofficially, according to information collected by Mossad human sources in Krakow and Gdansk, it functioned as a meeting and coordination point for those seeking to leave communist Poland through unofficial channels. The difference between these two realities was exactly what Uri Geller and his team needed to map with surgical precision. While Geller walked through the frozen streets of Warsaw, 3 other Israeli operatives had already taken their positions in the complex choreography of this infiltration. Sarah Feldman, an expert in documentation and forgery, with 15 years of experience in European operations, had arrived 2 days earlier disguised as a professor of Hebrew literature from the University of Warsaw. Her documents, meticulously prepared by technicians in Tel Aviv, included fake but convincing letters of recommendation, academic certificates with authentic seals, and even photographs of her participating in academic conferences that never happened. Attention to detail was a fundamental characteristic of Mossad operations in this period, when a poorly prepared document or an inconsistent story could mean not only the failure of the mission, but imprisonment, torture, and potentially death. David Rosen, the 3rd member of the team, had established cover as a commercial representative for a Zurich-based pharmaceutical import company. His specialty was social penetration, the ability to quickly establish trust relationships with specific targets through apparently casual conversations that revealed critical information. Rosen mastered not only Polish, but also Varsovian Yiddish, with all its regional nuances, a linguistic skill that had taken years to develop and would now prove essential for gaining the trust of the synagogue's regulars. He knew that many of Warsaw's older Jews automatically switched between Polish and Yiddish, depending on the context of the conversation, and any hesitation or error in pronunciation could arouse fatal suspicions. The 4th operative, Miriam Katz, was perhaps the most important element of this complex operation. An expert in clandestine communications and a former liaison officer with resistance networks in Eastern Europe, she had been specifically chosen for her experience in identifying and mapping illegal organizational structures. Katz understood how clandestine groups communicated, how they established security protocols, and more importantly, how they could be infiltrated without being destroyed. Her cover as a war widow searching for missing relatives was emotionally compelling and provided a natural justification for asking questions about people and places without raising suspicion. The Twarda Street Synagogue was not just a place of worship. It was a microcosm of the political and social complexities of communist Poland in the late 1960s. Władysław Gomułka's regime, maintained an ambiguous relationship with the remaining Jewish population. Officially, it guaranteed religious and cultural freedom, but in practice, it exercised constant surveillance over any activity that could be interpreted as Zionist or anti-state. This ambiguity created a murky space where semi-legal activities could flourish as long as they maintained a low profile and did not openly challenge the authorities. It was exactly in this murky space that the emigration network had found fertile ground for its operations. The Polish intelligence services, coordinated by the Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, maintained routine surveillance over all Jewish places of worship, but this surveillance followed predictable patterns that experienced operatives could identify and circumvent. Uri Geller had studied these patterns during weeks of preparation in Tel Aviv, analyzing reports from previous agents and surveillance photographs documenting the movements of Polish agents around the synagogue. He knew that Thursdays were the days of least surveillance, when only one agent remained stationed at the corner cafe, and that this agent usually left his position between 15 and 30 minutes to 4 in the afternoon for his mandatory cigarette break. The operation depended not only on precise timing, but also on a deep understanding of the Jewish community psychology in Warsaw. Regular synagogue goers formed a closed and distrustful group, conditioned by decades of persecution and surveillance to quickly identify any foreign element in their midst. To penetrate this circle of trust, each member of the Mossad team needed not only to master linguistic and cultural aspects, but also to demonstrate intimate knowledge of religious traditions, family history, and even local gossip that only genuine insiders could know. Preparation for this infiltration had begun months earlier in a safe house on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, where experts in Polish Jewish culture conducted intensive cultural immersion sessions. The four operatives learned not only about religious practices and culinary traditions, but also about the intricate network of family relationships that connected practically all the remaining Jews in Warsaw. They memorized names, dates, war stories, and even personal preferences of dozens of individuals they might encounter in the synagogue, creating personas that would fit naturally into the social fabric of the community. The central question motivating this entire complex operation was not simply to map an emigration network, but to determine if this network could be utilized or expanded to serve Israel's strategic interests in the region. With rising tensions in the Middle East and the prospect of future armed conflicts, the Mossad was constantly seeking ways to establish evacuation routes for Jews in potentially hostile countries. The Warsaw network, if confirmed as operational and reliable, could serve as a model for similar operations in other Eastern Bloc capitals, creating a continental evacuation system that could save thousands of lives in the event of a new wave of anti-Semitic persecution. When Uri Geller finally approached the side entrance of the synagogue on that frozen Thursday in January, carrying a small leather bag containing miniaturized recording equipment and a camera disguised as a prayer book, he knew that the next 90 minutes would determine not only the success of his individual mission, but potentially the fate of hundreds of Polish Jews who waited in silence for an opportunity to leave the country. The biting cold that penetrated through his clothes was only the first of many challenges he and his team would face in the coming hours, in an operation that would test every aspect of their training and experience in one of the most dangerous environments of the European Cold War. Sarah Feldman had spent the last 48 hours establishing her presence in the Warsaw Jewish community through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings that took her from university classrooms to the private homes of respected Jewish families in the city. Her infiltration strategy depended on a sophisticated understanding of how new members were integrated into Jewish social networks in communist Poland, where distrust was the norm and acceptance had to be earned through consistent demonstrations of cultural knowledge and religious commitment. As a documentation specialist, Feldman knew that her cover had to withstand not only casual verification, but also the detailed scrutiny that would inevitably arise if someone decided to investigate her credentials more deeply. The professor of Hebrew literature she portrayed was not a randomly chosen persona, but the result of months of research into specific gaps in the Warsaw Jewish academic community. Analysts in Tel Aviv had identified that the University of Warsaw actually needed an expert in medieval Hebrew literature, and that this need had been mentioned in several academic meetings during the previous 6 months. Feldman had not only memorized obscure texts by 12th century Hebrew poets, but also developed original theories about their works that could withstand questioning by real academics. Her intellectual background was as convincing as her forged documents. During her first visit to the synagogue the previous Tuesday, Feldman had identified at least 3 individuals who clearly exercised organizational functions beyond their apparent religious activities. Rabbi Goldstein, a 65-year-old man with a grey beard and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate every new visitor with professional suspicion, held whispered conversations with certain regulars after regular services. Mrs. Rosenbaum, the widow of a fabric merchant killed during the war, distributed small slips of paper to specific people during morning prayers, always with discreet movements that suggested coded communication. Mr. Bernstein, apparently a simple retiree who helped with synagogue maintenance, demonstrated surprisingly detailed knowledge of train schedules and road routes to border towns. David Rosen had taken advantage of his cover as a merchant to establish economic contacts that provided natural access to conversations about the movement of people and goods across Polish borders. His temporary office in a small hotel in central Warsaw served as a base for meetings with local pharmaceutical suppliers, many of whom maintained operations that navigated the grey areas of communist regulation. During these apparently routine meetings, Rosen discovered that several of his business contacts had family or financial connections with members of the Twarder Street congregation, creating a network of relationships that extended far beyond the physical limits of the synagogue. Rosen's ability to quickly establish rapport with locals derived not only from his linguistic fluency, but from his deep understanding of the economic anxieties that dominated life in communist Poland in the late 1960s. He knew exactly which products were scarce, which regulations were routinely ignored, and which authorities could be influenced through discreet gifts or mutual favors. This understanding allowed him to position himself as a valuable intermediary for his local contacts, creating reciprocity obligations that facilitated obtaining sensitive information about population movements and clandestine activities in the city. During an apparently casual conversation with an aspirin distributor the previous Wednesday, Rosen had discovered that medications frequently disappeared from official stocks, only to reappear in pharmacies in border towns, suggesting well-established smuggling routes that could be used for purposes beyond the pharmaceutical trade. When the distributor casually mentioned that some people need special medications for long trips, Rosen immediately recognized the characteristic linguistic code of clandestine emigration operations, where special medications, often referred to forged documents and long trips, meant permanent departures from the country. Miriam Katz had concentrated her efforts on mapping the network's internal communications through systematic observation of behavior patterns in the synagogue during different periods of the day. Her previous experience with resistance networks had taught her that clandestine organizations develop specific routines for exchanging information and coordinating activities, and that these routines generally camouflage themselves within apparently normal and innocent activities. Katz spent hours observing who spoke to whom, when these conversations occurred, how long they lasted, and whether they followed recognizable temporal patterns. Her cover as a widow searching for missing relatives provided a natural justification for asking questions about people and places, but also allowed her to demonstrate emotional vulnerability that often induced others to share information in the hope of offering comfort or assistance. Katz had learned that people involved in clandestine emigration activities often felt contradictory impulses to help others in similar situations, even at significant personal risk. Her persona carefully exploited this altruistic tendency without crossing lines that could arouse suspicion. During 3 days of preliminary observation, Katz identified at least 2 distinct communication networks operating within the synagogue. The first seemed focused on domestic issues: food distribution, financial assistance for needy families, and coordination of medical care for elderly congregation members. The second network operated at a more discreet level, involving whispered conversations between specific individuals that always occurred in particular locations of the synagogue and were always interrupted immediately if someone approached. It was this second network that represented the true target of the Israeli operation. The Warsaw Street synagogue had been built following traditional architectural patterns that included several features facilitating clandestine activities, although these features were originally designed for legitimate religious purposes. The study room on the second floor had two separate entrances, allowing people to enter and leave without being observed by those using the main entrance. The basement, officially used for storage of religious books and ceremonial utensils, included a corridor that connected with the city's sewer system, providing an emergency escape route that had been used during the German occupation and apparently continued to be maintained in operational condition. The 4 Israeli operatives had coordinated their movements to converge on the synagogue during the period of greatest activity on Thursday afternoon, when preparations for Shabbat created a natural flow of people entering and leaving the building. Uri Geller would be the first to enter, using his journalistic cover to request permission to photograph architectural aspects of the building for an article on the preservation of Jewish heritage in Poland. Sarah Feldman would arrive 15 minutes later, ostensibly to consult rare texts in the synagogue library. David Rosen would appear during a break in his commercial meetings, explaining an interest in making a donation for the building's maintenance. Miriam Katz would be the last to arrive, continuing her search for information about missing relatives. The temporal coordination of this convergence had been calculated to maximize observation opportunities, while minimizing the possibility that 4 people relatively new to the community would draw attention by being present simultaneously. Each operative carried short-range communication equipment that would allow discrete coordination during the operation, but these devices were disguised as common personal objects, pens, glasses, coat buttons and brooches that would not arouse suspicion even in the event of a personal search. Mossad communication technology in 1968 was primitive compared to later standards, but still sophisticated enough to provide a significant operational advantage over targets who did not expect to be under investigation by foreign intelligence. The issue of photographic documentation presented particular technical challenges in this environment. The miniaturized cameras available for clandestine operations in 1968 required adequate lighting to produce usable images, but the Warsaw Street synagogue had limited internal lighting that created dense shadows in many areas where important activities might be occurring. Uri Geller had solved this problem by bringing flash equipment disguised as legitimate journalistic gear, but the use of a flash would draw additional attention that needed to be managed carefully so as not to interfere with his colleagues' activities. Preparations for this critical phase of the operation included not only technical and logistical considerations, but also psychological preparation for scenarios where improvisation might become necessary. Each operative had memorized alternative cover stories that could be used if their primary personas were questioned or compromised. They had also established protocols for aborting the mission if hostile surveillance signals were detected, and evacuation routes that would lead them to safe houses in different parts of the city before eventual exfiltration to West Germany through Israeli diplomatic channels. When Uri Geller finally pushed open the heavy wooden door of the synagogue and felt the relative warmth of the interior contrasting with the brutal cold of the street, he knew he was crossing not just a physical threshold, but also entering a phase of the operation where every word, every gesture, and every facial expression would be crucial to the success or failure of months of meticulous planning. The sound of his boots echoing on the stone floor of the main entrance announced the arrival of another visitor to the Warsaw Street synagogue, but only he knew that this particular visit could fundamentally alter the fate of hundreds of people who silently waited for an opportunity to escape communist Poland and rebuild their lives in freedom. The interior of the synagogue immediately revealed the social complexity that preliminary reports had only suggested, with distinct groups of worshippers occupying different areas of the main space, according to informal hierarchies, reflecting not only age and gender, but also economic status, family connections, and more subtly, levels of trust within the community. Uri Geller observed that the older men congregated near the Holy Ark, where their whispered Yiddish conversations were periodically interrupted by cautious glances toward new arrivals. Women occupied the left section of the main space, but their interactions seemed equally structured by security considerations with certain women clearly exercising screening roles to determine who could participate in more intimate conversations. The internal architecture of the synagogue had been subtly modified since its post-war reconstruction, with changes that initially appeared aesthetic, but, under closer examination, revealed operational functionality. Small mirrors had been strategically positioned to allow discrete observation of multiple areas simultaneously. Religious bookshelves included hidden compartments that could serve for storage of documents or other sensitive materials. Even the arrangement of the pews had been adjusted to create private conversation zones where whispers would not be easily heard by other worshippers or by listening devices that Polish authorities might have installed. Rabbi Goldstein approached Uri Geller with the mix of religious hospitality and professional caution that characterized Jewish community leaders in communist Poland, offering warm welcomes while simultaneously evaluating the visitor's credentials and intentions through apparently casual questions that tested knowledge of specific traditions, people, and places. Geller responded with studied precision, demonstrating familiarity with religious texts and community history without exhibiting excessively detailed knowledge that could arouse suspicion about his true origins and purposes. The initial conversation between Geller and Rabbi Goldstein followed established social protocols that allowed the rabbi to evaluate not only the visitor's religious legitimacy, but also his potential reliability for more sensitive issues that might arise later. Geller realized he was being tested through oblique references to people and events that only someone genuinely connected to the Polish Jewish community could recognize, and he responded with information he had memorized during his intensive preparation, but always with the natural hesitation of someone trying to recall details from old conversations or distant family relationships. 15 minutes after Geller's arrival, Sarah Feldman entered the synagogue, carrying a leather folder containing genuine academic notes on medieval Hebrew literature that would provide substance for any scholarly discussion that might arise during her visit. Her infiltration strategy depended on establishing intellectual credibility that would give her access to the synagogue library, where important documents might be stored, and also to conversations with educated congregation members who might possess information about emigration operations. Feldman knew that educated Jewish women were often responsible for logistical aspects of clandestine operations, especially those involving communication and coordination between different cells or groups. The synagogue library occupied a room adjacent to the main prayer space, accessible through a door that remained open during normal operating hours but could be closed to provide privacy for meetings or special activities. The book collection included not only traditional religious texts but also volumes on Jewish history, literature, and even practical manuals on emigration that were ostensibly intended for Jews considering moving to Israel through official channels, but which could contain useful information for those planning departures through unauthorized means. Feldman quickly identified Mrs. Rosenbaum as the person most likely responsible for organizing the library and controlling access to sensitive materials. The widow demonstrated impressive knowledge about the collection's content and which specific books might interest different visitors, suggesting she maintained a detailed mental record of who consulted what materials and when. This apparently administrative function could easily serve as cover for internal intelligence activities, where information about the interests and needs of different people would be collected and analyzed to determine eligibility for participation in more sensitive operations. David Rosen arrived at the synagogue during a moment of natural transition when several people were leaving the building after completing afternoon prayers, allowing his entry to appear casual and uncoordinated with the earlier arrivals of other relatively new visitors. His approach to Rabbi Goldstein included mention of an interest in making a donation for the building's maintenance, a pretext that would provide justification for examining different areas of the physical structure while demonstrating financial commitment to the community that could open doors to conversations about the congregation's broader needs. Rosen's offer of a donation was received with genuine gratitude, mixed with professional caution, characteristic of all community interactions in state surveillance environments. Rabbi Goldstein explained that the synagogue indeed needed repairs to the heating system and improvements to the building's security, but his explanations included details about access to the basement and utility systems that revealed more detailed architectural knowledge than would be expected from someone concerned only with routine religious issues. Rosen interpreted this information as confirmation that the building was used for purposes beyond traditional religious worship. Miriam Katz was the last to arrive, about 30 minutes after Uri Geller, when the synagogue had reached its peak afternoon activity period, with approximately 50 people present for various activities ranging from individual prayers to smaller community group meetings. Her entry deliberately coincided with this peak period to maximize her observation opportunities while minimizing the attention her presence might attract. Katz possessed a unique advantage among the four operatives because her cover as a widow searching for missing relatives evoked natural sympathy that often resulted in voluntary assistance from other synagogue goers. Katz's strategy for mapping internal communications depended on positioning herself strategically, where she could observe interactions between different groups, while apparently focusing on consulting family records or examining photographs of previous congregations that might contain images of her supposed missing relatives. Her position in the central area of the synagogue provided sightlines to the library, to the area near the altar where elderly men congregated, and to the staircase leading to the second floor where more private meetings apparently took place. During her first 20 minutes in the synagogue, Katz observed 3 discrete exchanges of small objects between different pairs of people, always executed during moments of natural movement when other worshippers were moving to different areas or participating in religious activities that created visual and auditory distraction. The objects exchanged were too small to be identified with precision, but the behavioral patterns associated with these exchanges, discrete verification that they were not being observed, timing coordinated with moments of distraction, and subsequent immediate separation of the participants, were consistent with clandestine communication. The convergence of the 4 Israeli operatives at the synagogue had been executed with a precision that did not draw special attention, but which also did not go completely unnoticed by individuals within the congregation who had security responsibilities for sensitive operations. Mr. Bernstein, the apparently retired man responsible for building maintenance, demonstrated a subtle but perceptible interest in the temporal coincidence of these 4 visits by people who were relatively new to the community. His movements through the building over the next hour allowed him to discreetly observe each of the visitors and evaluate their behaviors and interactions with other worshippers. The first phase of the infiltration had been concluded with technical success, but the Israeli operatives quickly realized they were operating in a much more sophisticated environment than their preliminary briefings had suggested. The clandestine emigration network was not simply a group of desperate citizens seeking informal assistance to leave the country, but rather a structured operation with security protocols, organizational hierarchy, and possibly connections with other similar networks in different Polish cities or even in other Eastern Bloc countries. This realization significantly increased the potential importance of their mission, but also substantially raised the risks associated with detection or exposure. The next 60 minutes would determine if the 4 operatives could penetrate the security layers of this clandestine organization without alerting its leaders to the presence of foreign intelligence investigating their activities. Success would depend not only on their technical skills and cultural preparation, but also on their ability to adapt their strategies in real time as they discovered more about the true nature and extent of the network they had been sent to map. The brutal winter cold of Warsaw outside seemed almost insignificant compared to the psychological tension that now permeated every interaction inside the synagogue, where a poorly chosen word or a suspicious gesture could compromise not only their mission, but also the lives of all the people who depended on this network for their hopes of escape from communist Poland. The discovery that the emigration network operated with sophistication far beyond initial expectations forced the 4 Israeli operatives to adjust their strategies in real time, transitioning from simple information gathering to complex analysis of an organization that clearly possessed experience in security countermeasures and infiltration detection. Uri Geller realized this reality when Rabbi Goldstein began asking questions about his journalistic credentials that demonstrated surprisingly detailed knowledge about Israeli publications and their correspondence in Eastern Europe, suggesting that the religious leader maintained active intelligence on journalists who might have connections with Israeli security services. Geller's response to the rabbi's increasingly specific questions required careful improvisation that kept his cover intact, while avoiding contradictions that could be verified later through contacts the network apparently maintained in European journalistic circles. He provided details about articles he had genuinely written for Israeli publications, but subtly modified the circumstances of his research to eliminate references to government sources or information that only intelligence operatives could possess. This delicate verbal dance continued for 15 minutes, while both men mutually evaluated their credentials and intentions through apparently friendly conversations about cultural journalism. While Geller navigated this disguised interrogation, Sarah Feldman had discovered that Mrs. Rosenbaum possessed an academic background in history that made her capable of critically evaluating the credentials and knowledge Feldman presented as a university professor. The widow asked penetrating questions about research methodologies in medieval Hebrew literature that tested not only factual knowledge, but also familiarity with contemporary academic debates and specific personalities in the field of Hebrew studies. Feldman responded with genuine competence, based on months of intensive preparation, but began to suspect that her answers were being evaluated not only for academic accuracy, but also for consistency with profiles of academics who might have motivations beyond purely intellectual research. The synagogue library revealed itself to be much more organized and catalogued than it appeared on the surface, with a classification system that went far beyond traditional religious categorization to include sections dedicated to the history of Jewish emigration, political analyses of different European countries, and even practical manuals on border procedures and travel documentation. Mrs. Rosenbaum demonstrated impressive knowledge about the specific content of hundreds of volumes, including details on which books contained information on specific emigration routes and which authors had written about personal experiences of leaving Poland through different methods and in different historical periods. David Rosen had discovered that his offer of a donation for building maintenance opened conversations about the community's financial needs that extended far beyond basic structural repairs to include special assistance for families in transition and support for travelers with specific needs. Rabbi Goldstein explained these needs in carefully coded language that could be interpreted innocently by casual observers, but which clearly referred to clandestine emigration operations. The rabbi also mentioned that the synagogue maintained fraternal relations with Jewish congregations in several border cities, a euphemism that likely described a coordination network for moving people across Polish borders. The conversation about financial aspects of the synagogue's operations revealed organizational complexity that included not only local fundraising, but also receiving contributions from Jewish brothers abroad through channels that avoided Polish government scrutiny. Rosen interpreted these references as evidence that the network had international financial connections, possibly including Jewish organizations in West Germany, France, or even the United States, providing material resources for emigration operations. This international dimension significantly elevated the strategic importance of the network and also suggested that its discovery and potential compromise could have ramifications far beyond Polish borders. Miriam Katz had positioned herself where she could observe the discrete communications that continued to occur between different congregation members and gradually began to discern patterns that suggested at least 3 hierarchical levels within the clandestine organization. The first level consisted of regular synagogue goers who apparently possessed limited knowledge about special activities, but who served as an initial screening to identify people who might be interested in emigration. The second level included individuals like Mrs. Rosenbaum and Mr. Bernstein, who had specific operational responsibilities related to logistics, communication, and security. The third level apparently consisted of only a few people, including Rabbi Goldstein, who made strategic decisions and maintained connections with similar networks in other locations. Observation of communication patterns also revealed that the network used a sophisticated visual signaling system that included specific positioning of religious objects, subtle changes in furniture arrangement, and even variations in the clothing of specific people to transmit information about operational security. timing of activities, and availability of services. Katz realized that certain combinations of signals apparently indicated that special meetings would occur at specific times or locations, while other combinations served as alerts about the presence of authorities or the need to temporarily suspend sensitive activities. The growing understanding of the true sophistication of this clandestine operation began to create operational dilemmas for the four Israelis, who realized that their original mission of simply mapping an informal emigration network had evolved into the infiltration of an organization that possessed many characteristics of a professional intelligence service. This organization clearly maintained surveillance over its own members, conducted background checks on new participants, used advanced security countermeasures, and had established protocols for dealing with suspected infiltration. The possibility that their presence had already been detected and that they themselves were being investigated while conducting their investigation created additional layers of operational complexity. Uri Geller had his first confirmation that the network possessed counterintelligence capabilities when Rabbi Goldstein casually mentioned that the congregation occasionally received visits from journalists interested in our community, and that some of these visits subsequently resulted in unwanted interest from local authorities. This statement was made in a conversational tone that could be interpreted as a simple social observation, but it clearly constituted a warning that the network was aware of the possibility of infiltration by journalists who might have motivations beyond cultural reporting, and that it had previous experience with situations where apparently innocent visitors subsequently brought security problems. Geller's response to this oblique warning needed to demonstrate an understanding of the rabbi's concern, while simultaneously reaffirming his legitimacy as a genuine journalist without hidden motives. He explained that his interest in Warsaw's Jewish community derived from a personal concern with the preservation of cultural traditions that were disappearing in many places in Eastern Europe, and that he perfectly understood the reasons why communities like this needed to be cautious about external attention that could create difficulties with government authorities. This explanation apparently satisfied the rabbi's immediate concerns, but also established an expectation that Geller would demonstrate appropriate sensitivity regarding community security issues in any material he subsequently published. Sarah Feldman faced a similar test when Mrs. Rosenbaum casually asked about her other research activities and if she had collaborated with colleagues from different countries on projects related to Jewish history. The synagogue librarian was clearly investigating whether Feldman had academic connections that might include researchers or institutions with links to Israeli security services or those of other Western countries. Feldman responded by providing details about genuine academic collaborations she had established during her preparation for this operation, but carefully avoided mentioning any association that could be verified and discovered as fictitious. The library revealed itself to be a much more extensive repository of information about emigration activities than any normal synagogue could legitimately justify possessing. Beyond books on the history of Jewish emigration that could be explained as cultural interest, the collection included updated manuals on border procedures for multiple European countries, detailed maps of border regions showing secondary roads and unofficial crossings, and even literature on political asylum procedures in Western countries. Mrs. Rosenbaum explained this comprehensive collection as the result of academic interest in contemporary issues of Jewish migration, but the precision and timeliness of much of the information clearly exceeded what would be necessary for purely academic purposes. David Rosen discovered that the synagogue's financial needs included items that were clearly related to clandestine operations: special communication equipment, vehicles for community transport that needed specific modifications for the comfort of elderly passengers, and fees for consultants specialized in complex legal issues. Each of these expenditure categories could be explained legitimately in the context of a synagogue's normal activities, but collectively they suggested an operational budget for clandestine emigration activities involving secure communications, transport modified for human smuggling, and specialized legal advice on immigration and asylum issues. Rabbi Goldstein also revealed that the synagogue maintained special funds for emergency assistance to families facing specific difficulties a euphemism that likely described resources available to fund emigration operations for people who did not have their own financial means to pay for documentation, transport, and other costs associated with a clandestine departure from the country. The existence of these special funds implied that the network did not operate only for affluent people who could pay for emigration services, but also functioned as a humanitarian organization that helped Polish Jews regardless of their financial capacity. Miriam Katz observed that communications inside the synagogue had intensified during the period when the 4 relatively new visitors were present, with more whispered conversations, more discreet exchanges of small objects, and more coordinated movements between different areas of the building. This intensification could indicate that the network's normal activities were being accelerated to complete important business before the visitors could observe too much, or alternatively, that the presence of the visitors themselves had triggered security protocols involving additional communication to evaluate and respond to potential threats. The realization that they themselves might be under investigation by the network they were trying to map created an urgent need for coordination among the 4 Israeli operatives, but this coordination had to be executed without using their electronic communication devices, which could be detected by scanning equipment the network might possess. Instead, they used pre-established visual signals to communicate status and concerns. Geller adjusted his tie in a specific way to indicate he had detected suspicious activity. Feldman repositioned her folder to confirm she had received the message. Rosen cleaned his glasses in a particular way to signal he had also observed signs of investigation, and Katz discreetly touched her brooch to indicate she understood the elevated alert situation. The next 45 minutes of their operation in the synagogue would require extremely careful navigation between the need to obtain additional information about the network and the need to avoid actions that could confirm suspicions that they represented foreign intelligence infiltration. Success would depend on their ability to maintain their covers while simultaneously gathering intelligence on an organization that clearly had experience in detecting and neutralizing security threats. Warsaw's Arctic weather had become less important than the psychological climate inside the synagogue, where every gesture and every word carried the potential for operational success or disaster that could affect not only their own lives, but also the fate of the entire emigration network that hundreds of Polish Jews depended on for their hopes of freedom and safety. The mutual perception that both sides were conducting reconnaissance operations created an atmosphere of controlled tension inside the synagogue, where apparently casual conversations acquired layers of meaning that transcended their superficial content. Uri Geller had become aware that Rabbi Goldstein was not simply being cautious with an unknown journalist, but was actively testing his legitimacy through questions that revealed surprisingly detailed knowledge about Israeli intelligence operations in Eastern Europe. When the rabbi casually asked if Geller had collaborated with colleagues from Shin Bet on reports about community security, the question clearly transcended casual interest to constitute a direct investigation into possible connections with Israeli security services. Geller's response to this provocative question needed to deny any involvement with Israeli intelligence without sounding defensive or evasive, which could confirm suspicions that he had exactly the connections he was denying. He explained that, as a journalist focused on cultural issues, he occasionally received security briefings from Israeli authorities about potential risks when reporting in countries with political tensions, but that these briefings were routine for journalists working in certain regions and did not constitute any form of operational cooperation. This explanation was technically true based on the journalistic cover Geller actually maintained, but it omitted his true relationship with the Mossad. The sophistication of Rabbi Goldstein's questions suggested he possessed information sources on Israeli operations that went beyond what would be expected from a religious community leader, even one involved in clandestine activities. The possibility that the emigration network maintained connections with other intelligence services, possibly including Soviet or Polish agencies that might have infiltrated the organization for their own purposes, introduced a new level of operational complexity that the mission planners in Tel Aviv had not anticipated. If Rabbi Goldstein had access to information about Israeli operatives active in Eastern Europe, It could indicate that the entire operation had already been compromised before it even began. Sarah Feldman faced a similar escalation in her interaction with Mrs. Rosenbaum when the librarian specifically asked about her methodology for verifying historical sources and if she had developed expertise in detecting forged documents during her research. These apparently academic questions clearly referred to Feldman's ability to distinguish between genuine and forged documentation, a skill that would be crucial for any legitimate academic, but also essential for intelligence operatives responsible for creating or detecting false identities. Mrs. Rosenbaum was essentially asking if Feldman possessed technical skills that would suggest training in document forgery. The library had revealed itself not only as a repository for information on emigration, but also as a laboratory for the production and verification of forged documentation. Feldman observed equipment that initially appeared related to the preservation of old books, but which, under closer examination, included presses, specialized cameras, and chemical supplies that could be used for the production of official seals, alteration of photographs, and creation of convincing identity documents. Mrs. Rosenbaum explained these materials as necessary for the restoration of damaged religious texts, but the configuration and types of equipment were clearly appropriate for much more sophisticated forgery operations. David Rosen discovered that his conversation about financial donations had evolved into a detailed discussion about investment opportunities that could benefit the community while providing appropriate returns for contributors. Rabbi Goldstein explained that the synagogue occasionally acted as an intermediary for business relationships between local community members and international Jewish organizations, a description that likely referred to money laundering operations that transformed illegal funds derived from emigration operations into legitimate investments that could be explained to Polish tax authorities. The financial complexity of these operations suggested that the network had developed capabilities in multiple criminal areas beyond simple document forgery and people smuggling, including illegal currency exchange, clandestine bank transfers, and possibly even commercial smuggling of goods in addition to people. Rosen realized he was investigating not simply a humanitarian emigration operation, but a sophisticated criminal organization that used emigration activities as only one component of a broader enterprise that could include multiple forms of contraband and illegal finance. Miriam Katz had observed that several people left the synagogue during the last 30 minutes, but that their departures followed coordinated patterns that suggested pre-planning rather than coincidence. 3 middle-aged men left together after a brief conversation with Mr. Bernstein, followed 10 minutes later by 2 women who had been consulting materials in the library with Mrs. Rosenbaum. 15 minutes after that, an elderly couple left the building after greeting Rabbi Goldstein in a way that included a prolonged handshake that could have involved the transfer of small objects. The possibility that these departures represented a gradual evacuation of important people or the removal of sensitive materials in response to the presence of the 4 relatively new visitors created an urgent need for the Israeli operatives to obtain critical information before opportunities were permanently lost. Katz signaled the others through discreet visual communication that she had observed these movements and that she considered it important to accelerate their investigations before more important people or materials disappeared from the synagogue. The coordination between the 4 operatives needed to increase without becoming obvious to observers in the synagogue who were clearly maintaining surveillance over each of them. Uri Geller initiated an apparently casual conversation with Sarah Feldman about historical preservation methods that allowed them to exchange information discreetly about what each had discovered during their individual investigations. Feldman confirmed she had observed equipment consistent with document forgery operations, while Geller reported that Rabbi Goldstein demonstrated knowledge about Israeli intelligence operations that exceeded normal expectations. David Rosen joined this conversation by expressing interest in preservation techniques for old documents related to the synagogue's financial records, allowing him to share information about the sophisticated financial operations he had uncovered. Miriam Katz approached the group ostensibly to ask about methods for locating historical records of family members, enabling her to report the coordinated departures she had observed and her assessment that they might be under investigation by the very network they were investigating. The convergence of the four operatives in a single conversation group inevitably attracted the attention of Rabbi Goldstein and other network leadership members, who clearly recognized that people who had arrived separately and claimed different purposes for their visits were now coordinating their activities in a way that suggested a prior relationship or shared agenda. Mr. Bernstein approached the group to offer assistance with any questions about our community history they might have, but his approach clearly represented an attempt to monitor their conversation and assess whether they represented a coordinated threat. The response of the four operatives to this obvious surveillance needed to balance several competing priorities: maintaining their individual cover stories, avoiding confirmation that they were working together, gathering maximum possible intelligence about the network before security measures completely shut down their access, and creating a plausible exit strategy that would not trigger pursuit or retaliation against other Jewish families who depended on this network for escape opportunities. Uri Geller addressed Mr. Bernstein's offer of assistance by explaining that the four visitors had naturally gravitated toward each other because they all shared an academic or professional interest in Jewish cultural preservation, an explanation that was technically truthful but omitted their shared professional background in intelligence operations. He suggested that their spontaneous collaboration could result in more comprehensive documentation of the historical significance of the synagogue and the community, potentially benefiting preservation efforts that clearly were important to congregation leaders. Rabbi Goldstein's response to this suggestion revealed final confirmation that the network possessed counterintelligence capabilities well beyond normal expectations for a clandestine emigration operation. He agreed that comprehensive documentation could be beneficial, but proposed that any such documentation should be reviewed by the community leadership before publication, to ensure it would not inadvertently reveal information that could create difficulties with local authorities or compromise the privacy of community members. This proposal effectively constituted a demand for a censorship preview of any materials the operatives might attempt to remove from the synagogue, indicating that Rabbi Goldstein understood completely that visitors claiming legitimate cultural or academic interests might actually be conducting intelligence gathering for purposes that could threaten network security. His willingness to accommodate their requests subject to review suggested confidence that his organization could control information flow efficiently enough to prevent meaningful intelligence leakage, even while permitting partial cooperation with suspected foreign operatives. The 45 minutes remaining in their synagogue infiltration would require navigating increasingly complex dynamics, where each side understood that the other side suspected their true purposes, but where both sides possessed incentives to continue the charade of normal cultural exchange, while simultaneously gathering intelligence and implementing security countermeasures. The success of Operation Red Snow depended on whether the Israeli operatives could extract sufficient actionable intelligence about network operations, capabilities, and connections before the network leadership concluded that security risks outweighed any potential benefits of continued interaction. The Arctic weather outside the synagogue had become a secondary consideration compared to the psychological climate inside, where the temperature had dropped to levels that required constant attention to prevent operational mistakes that could trigger a rapid deterioration in a situation that already balanced precariously between successful penetration and a potential disaster that could affect hundreds of people depending on this sophisticated clandestine organization for their hopes of freedom and safety in the increasingly dangerous political environment of late 1960s Eastern Europe. The final phase of the operation required the four Israeli operatives to extract as much information as possible, while executing a strategic exit that would not confirm the growing suspicions about their true identities and purposes, a delicate dance that would test all aspects of their training in situations where careful improvisation could mean the difference between operational success and a catastrophic compromise that would affect not only their own lives, but also the entire emigration network that hundreds of Polish Jews depended on to escape the communist regime. Uri Geller noticed that Rabbi Goldstein had subtly modified his body posture and tone of voice in ways that suggested a transition from defensive caution to preparation for more assertive action, possibly including security measures that could involve the physical detention of the suspicious visitors, until their identities and motivations could be verified through channels the network apparently maintained for such purposes. The synagogue library had gradually emptied of all regular attendees except Mrs. Rosenbaum, who remained in a position that allowed her to observe both the activities of the 4 visitors and any movement toward the building's exits. Sarah Feldman interpreted this positioning as evidence that Mrs. Rosenbaum had specific responsibilities in security protocols that included the prevention of unauthorized removal of materials or people who might possess sensitive information. The librarian had discreetly removed several volumes from the most accessible shelves and relocated them to a secured area behind her desk, suggesting that certain materials were considered too sensitive to remain available for inspection by suspected foreign operatives. David Rosen observed that Rabbi Goldstein had engaged in a series of brief, whispered conversations with Mr. Bernstein that resulted in the discreet positioning of additional community members in locations that effectively controlled access to all major exits of the synagogue building. These positions featured apparently casual congregants reading or engaging in private prayers, but their locations and timing created a surveillance network that could monitor any attempt by visitors to leave the building without proper coordination with community leadership. The sophistication of this response confirmed that the network possessed experience in dealing with potential security threats and maintained procedures for containing suspected infiltration until appropriate countermeasures could be implemented. Miriam Katz had continued observing communication patterns inside the synagogue and noticed that the frequency of discrete object exchanges had actually increased during the period when the 4 visitors were present, rather than decreased, as would be expected if the network were simply suspending normal operations in response to potential surveillance. This pattern suggested that the network leadership had decided to accelerate certain activities, possibly including the removal of critical materials or personnel, rather than suspending operations completely. The implication was that they considered the 4 visitors to represent an immediate threat that required an urgent response, rather than a longer-term security concern that could be addressed through gradual modifications to operational procedures. The decision to accelerate intelligence extraction while executing a strategic withdrawal required coordination among the 4 operatives that had to be accomplished without using their electronic communication devices, which might be detected by sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment that the network clearly possessed. Uri Geller initiated a conversation about the timing for completion of our documentation project that allowed team members to coordinate their exit strategy while maintaining their academic cover story. Each operative confirmed their readiness to withdraw through subtle verbal cues embedded in an apparently innocent discussion about research methodology and publication schedules. Sarah Feldman had managed to photograph several pages of materials related to emigration procedures, while maintaining the pretense of academic research, but her camera equipment had been noticed by Mrs. Rosenbaum, who made a casual comment about the importance of obtaining proper permissions for photographing historical materials. This comment constituted a clear warning that unauthorized documentation had been detected, and that continued attempts to gather photographic intelligence might trigger a more assertive security response. Feldman acknowledged this warning gracefully, while confirming to her colleagues that she had obtained some valuable intelligence, despite increasing restrictions on her access to sensitive materials. David Rosen had successfully gathered detailed information about the network's financial operations, including confirmation that the organization maintained international funding sources and sophisticated money laundering capabilities that supported multiple types of clandestine activities beyond emigration services. However, Rabbi Goldstein had concluded their discussion about donation opportunities by stating that any potential financial relationship would require thorough verification of credentials and references from trusted sources, effectively indicating that the network would conduct a background investigation before accepting any funding from unknown sources. This development suggested that any attempt to establish an ongoing relationship with the network would be subject to a counterintelligence investigation that might expose the true identities of the Israeli operatives. Miriam Katz had identified the approximate structure of the network hierarchy, and confirmed that the organization maintained connections with similar networks in other Polish cities, possibly extending into East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Her observation of communication patterns suggested that the network maintained regular contact with external partners through methods that avoided government surveillance, indicating capabilities that extended well beyond local emigration services to encompass regional coordination of multiple clandestine operations. However, her attempts to gather more specific information about these external connections had been subtly redirected by network members who clearly recognized that such information represented core operational security concerns. The challenge of extracting themselves from the synagogue without confirming suspicions about their true purposes required a careful balance between demonstrating respect for community concerns about security while avoiding behaviors that might be interpreted as an admission of guilt or fear of discovery. Uri Geller addressed this challenge by proposing that their documentation project would require several additional visits to complete comprehensive coverage of synagogue history and community traditions, a proposal that demonstrated a commitment to an ongoing relationship while creating a legitimate reason for ending the current visit without appearing to flee in response to security concerns. Rabbi Goldstein's response to this proposal revealed final critical intelligence about network capabilities when he mentioned that any future visits would need to be coordinated through proper channels that ensure community security and privacy, indicating that the network maintained formal screening procedures for regular visitors that went beyond simple verification of religious or academic credentials. This reference to proper channels suggested that the network had established relationships with Polish authorities or other organizations that could provide comprehensive background checks on people seeking ongoing access to community activities, representing a level of sophistication that approached professional intelligence service capabilities. The final phase of their infiltration concluded when each operative executed a coordinated departure that maintained their individual cover stories while demonstrating mutual respect for the community concerns expressed by leadership members. Uri Geller left first, carrying equipment that appeared consistent with journalistic documentation while actually containing photographic intelligence on the synagogue layout and community members. Sarah Feldman followed 10 minutes later, ostensibly to continue her academic research at other libraries in Warsaw, while actually preparing for the transmission of the intelligence she had gathered on document forgery operations and emigration procedures. David Rosen departed after a brief final conversation with Rabbi Goldstein about potential future cooperation in community support activities, a conversation that allowed him to confirm several details about financial operations while demonstrating continued interest in a legitimate relationship that might provide cover for future intelligence gathering efforts. Miriam Katz was the last to leave, maintaining her emotional cover as a widow, searching for information about missing family members while having successfully mapped network communication systems and identified key personnel responsible for security and external coordination. The four operatives regrouped at a predetermined safe house location in a different area of Warsaw to conduct an immediate debrief and coordinate the transmission of intelligence back to Tel Aviv, while the network leadership in the synagogue undoubtedly conducted their own assessment of what information might have been compromised during the afternoon's activities. The success of Operation Red Snow in penetrating a sophisticated clandestine organization operating at the heart of communist Warsaw demonstrated both the capabilities of Israeli intelligence for conducting complex infiltration operations in hostile territory and the existence of underground networks in Eastern Europe that possessed counterintelligence capabilities and international connections that significantly exceeded initial expectations. The intelligence gathered during the synagogue infiltration would provide the foundation for multiple follow-up operations aimed at understanding the broader scope of clandestine emigration networks throughout Eastern Europe and determining whether these networks could be utilized or expanded to serve Israeli strategic interests in the potentially dangerous political environment that characterized the final years of the 1960s, when tensions between East and West continued to escalate, and Jewish communities throughout communist countries remained vulnerable to persecution that could necessitate rapid evacuation through the same networks that 4 brave operatives had successfully penetrated during one frozen afternoon in Warsaw, when the temperature dropped to -28 degrees Celsius. But human determination for freedom burned with an intensity that transcended any physical discomfort or operational danger.